Hello, and welcome to another episode of Reading Rule, y'all. I'm Dr. Shay Parton, and this week we're continuing our deep dive into Monica Roe's most recent middle grades novel, Air. Before we dig into the analysis and reaction portion of this video, I just wanted to say another thanks for those of you who have filled out the Reading Rule Y'all survey. I really appreciate it. You don't know how much I appreciate it. If you still haven't had a chance, it's linked again in the description below. Thanks for helping me make this series helpful for you. Because that's what I want. I want it to be helpful to you and not just something fun that I enjoy doing, but something fun that I enjoy doing and is also supporting teachers in their endeavors to include critical rural perspectives in their classes. I'm not usually one to enjoy or to perform quantitative analysis, but it does seem helpful in determining what kind of content is speaking to y'all most and what feels most helpful. So thank you, Google Analytics. And in response to your input thus far, this week I'm going to combine my analysis and reactions into one video. And reflecting on your feedback, I realized that they're very similar anyways, and that I don't usually talk about any book that doesn't provide a complex and authentic depiction of rural life. So a video excoriating a book that was a terrible depiction of rural life and rural identities is probably not going to be part of this series. So I don't really need that video to be separate necessarily. So in this video, I will be giving my analysis as it's interwoven with my opinions regarding the depiction of rural life, just like I usually do. Now, I wrote a little bit about this in response to the Kirkus review of Air on Literacy and Place, which is also linked below. So I'm going to be building on that in my discussion and analysis today, just to let you know. Okay. One of the things that I really appreciate about Air and what Monica Roe does in it is that there is a complex layering of identities featured and reflected in Emmie's story, which is one of the most important aspects of this book and important aspects of the rural YA that I have been reading and talking about on this channel, because it's not something that we see a lot. It's not something that gets promoted or marketed a lot, but is extremely important for rural classrooms, but also for suburban and urban classrooms as well. If you've been watching these videos for any length of time, you have seen and heard me talk about the need to amplify the voices and stories of rural folks writ large, but most especially folks of color, queer folks, and other identities that aren't often thought of as being rural. Social class is another one of those, and is an important layer that is often forgotten or ignored. And it, along with race, age, and disability, as layered with rurality across various rural contexts, is something that we need to see more of, and that is present in this text, and present in a way that makes it as normal as it actually is. And so I really appreciated that. There's a lot of rich analysis there that can happen, but for this video I'm going to focus on how place in particular influences Emmie's experiences as a person, especially as a person who uses wheels. So the action of the novel is framed and driven by place. Place features in the way Emmie and her friend Alay work toward their goals. So for Emmie, getting a chair that is, or a set of wheels that is up to the task of wheelchair motocross. And for Alay, that is working towards more learning about her apiary and being a beekeeper. So place features in that way. Place features in the architecture of the school and how that makes it inaccessible or accessible to students who use wheels. And then also how Emmie navigates relationships, especially in the ways that people want and try to quote unquote help her. So in the opening of the book, we learn that the book takes place in rural South Carolina. Emmie, who narrates the text, says, "We may live out in the middle of Carolina scrubland where the soil looks more like beach sand and everything green turns right up brown by early July, but Alay and I are experts at selling what we scavenge or make because we are entrepreneurs with goals." So the rural South Carolina landscape here is a crucial element because Emmie and Alay collect Spanish moss, pine cones, and other natural aspects of the landscape to sell online as they work towards those goals, to their dreams. For Emmie, it's her motocross wheelchair, and for Alay, it's the stuff that she needs to keep growing as a beekeeper. While some folks might find it hard to imagine that Emmie can navigate this landscape, as she's described it, especially if the soil is more sand than not, she and Alay work together to make that possible and both have thriving online businesses as a result. The structural design of the school and the ways it is and isn't designed for folks who use wheels serve as the foundation for the conflict and movement of the story. So rural South Carolina is really important in that way. And then place in terms of the way that humans design it is also important because it's the structural design of the school and the ways that it is or isn't designed for folks who use wheels that serve as the foundation for the conflict and the movement of the story. The structural design of the school and the way it is and isn't designed for folks who use wheels serve as the foundation for the conflict and movement of the story. And so place and space and spatial design have a really, really important influence on the story. Emmie says, "Just like back at the elementary building, there's no automatic door, but I'm pretty good at popping the door open fast enough to get my front wheels through and wriggle my way inside." Because Emmie's rural school struggles, as most rural schools do, with funding, her tumble on a poorly designed and poorly maintained ramp sets the major events of the novel in motion. And it's this particular aspect of the book that made me think about my own schools, the one where I taught and also the one where I was a student, especially how the gymnasiums in both weren't really accessible for people with wheels. One gym was like recessed and like set sort of in the ground, and then the bleachers and stuff came up. And so like when we had Veterans Day and stuff like that, there was no way to get down the stairs with wheels, and there were no elevators, and so that wasn't accessible at all. And then the school where I went to, the gym wasn't recessed, but all of the bleachers of course go up, and there were like 2 sets of bleachers, and there were no ramps or anything, and there wasn't very much room between the last bleacher that came out onto the gym floor and like the basketball court. And so we use our gyms for everything. Convocations and programs and basketball games and concerts. I mean, we used them for everything, graduation ceremonies. And so for folks whose parents or grandparents who used wheels, like I remember being in those types of programs and just thinking about how it didn't seem fair, it didn't seem right, but no one ever did anything about it. So and I'm not sure that even now it's more accessible, either one of them, than it was when I was there. So just it's something that I think I noticed but didn't really bring to the forefront of my cognition or my critical thinking. And all of that came up for me when I was reading this book, which I think has some really cool connections to things that we can do as teachers to teach this book. So check out next week's teaching video where I think a little bit more about that. So not only does structural design affect the way that Emmie navigates the actual space and place of the school, but structural design also influences and shapes the way that Emmie navigates relationships. So Emmie has a friend, Devante, and she hurts his feelings because he's really into rodeo. And she says that she's not going to go see him perform in the rodeo, but doesn't tell him why at first, which really hurts his feelings. But then she realizes that no matter how embarrassing it is, she has to tell him. So she says, okay, the truth, I don't go to Seltzer's arena ever. Devante slowly sits back down. Because you hate rodeo? Just say it. Because of the bathrooms. The bathrooms, he repeats. Glory, I'm going to have to spell this out. Porta potties aren't the most accessible spots on the planet. I point to my wheels with both hands, in case he's 100% dense, then make for the door before I discover if you can literally die of embarrassment. So because of the way that this particular arena is designed and the lack of accessible restrooms, it's not a place that Emmie feels comfortable going to. It's also not a place or a thing that Emmie is comfortable talking about. But the design of the arena sort of makes that necessary for her. And so, again, structural design not only affects the way that Emmie navigates physical spaces, but also the sort of spaces that she creates as she navigates relationships. So speaking of relationships, because rural communities are often tight-knit, it's been my experience that folks are keen on helping each other out when they need it. The upside of the stereotype that everybody knows everybody else's business is that we can help each other out when we know that we need it. So it's in this way that place played a role in helping me critically question what it means and looks like to help, though, and how often we ask the people we want to help what they actually need and whether or not we listen when they tell us. So help is the second major factor in why Emmie tumbles on the ramp. She tells us, as I work my hand rims to slow my momentum enough to make the 180, my right front wheel hits the railing. I could have recovered it, but that doggone Logan, he sees what happened and flies over to help. Throwing his books aside, he gallops up the ramp like a mule with a burr. So Logan's efforts to help are decidedly unhelpful, and it causes Emmie to fall with her chair, which panics students who see it happen, and those students run to tell teachers. The teachers tell the principal, and so all of this results in just like a snowball of more unwelcome help. But I don't want to give any spoilers, so I'm not going to tell you exactly how. So through these aspects, I felt invited to critically examine the privilege that I have living in a world that was designed for me and the way that my body works, especially in rural spaces where there may not be funding to appropriately make spaces accessible. I think about, the crumbling sidewalks where I lived, and how annoying that was to navigate on crutches sometimes. And that was even just a temporary thing for me. It wasn't ever permanent. So just the upkeep of buildings, the sort of outdated design of buildings when universal design wasn't something that we thought about or that we talked about in terms of building design, and then sort of like trying to retrofit what exists into something that is accessible for everyone. It costs money, and that's one thing that rural places don't usually have a lot of, especially rural schools. Thinking about public funding, because it's all based on property taxes and head count. And so because of the way that works, rural spaces sometimes have trouble, have experienced difficulty making school spaces and other public places accessible to everyone who lives in their communities. So that's another thing to think about and consider. So because I read this book and had the opportunity to think about those things and really grapple with learning how to talk about people with disabilities, people who use wheels, and what their experiences are like, this book was such a huge gift to me, and I really can't recommend it enough. Thanks for tuning in. That's it for this time. Next time, I'm going to talk about some critical rural teaching ideas for this book and how I would use it in my classroom. But until then, y'all come back now, would ya?